Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We are continuing with the reading of Iqbal's Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. And we are looking at his comparison of Ghazali and Kant, Immanuel Kant. So we had stopped here last time. Proud but shallow rational moves. So now today we are starting from here. There is. So we start here. We stopped here. Proud but shallow rationalism, which moved in the same direction as Kantian rationalism in Germany, and we looked at it this in the previous session, and we saw that Iqbal's is mistaken in thinking that there are the similarities in Kant's and Ghazali's projects, which he has mentioned here. Now, since we have rejected Iqbal's claim that there are similarities, so now today we are looking at the differences which he notices. So there is, however, one important difference between Ghazali and Kant. Okay, Kant, consistently with his principle, could not affirm the possibility of knowledge of God. Could not affirm consistently with his principles, could not affirm the possibility of knowledge of God. Ghazali, finding no hope in analytic thought, moved to mystic experience, and they found an independent content for religion. Okay, so let us look at the claim that Kant doesn't have any conception of or any knowledge of God, or he denies the knowledge of God. Okay, I think I missed recording some of the stuff, so I'm not sure where I missed it. So I'll just repeat everything I said as far as I can remember. So knowledge for Kant is technical term. And knowledge for Kant consists of the input from senses and reason. By reason we mean understanding as well. And since we don't have any access to God through senses, because presumably he is not even a matter or anything which senses can perceive, is beyond this world where senses have access. So the input from senses is missing, so we can't have knowledge of God in that sense. We can't have knowledge of God in speculative knowledge of God as well, because though we have an idea of God, we have no way of knowing whether those ideas correspond to any reality, because we don't have any means to have access to that reality that is metaphysical reality. Now, in physical reality, we can compare our ideas to physical reality if our ideas are about physical reality, because through senses, presumably, we have access to physical reality. But since we don't have any access to, we don't have any sixth sense, or we don't have any intuition of metaphysical reality, we can speculate, but our speculation remains speculation, because we have no way of knowing whether our ideas correspond to reality or they don't correspond to reality. in this way, Kant, it's true that Kant denies that we have knowledge of God. And he also denies that we have speculative knowledge of God. So, for example, so that's why, for example, denies all the arguments for the existence of God and God, because at the end they are speculation, in the sense that there's no way for us to compare those arguments to the actual reality, because we can't have knowledge of existence through argument alone. We must have some sort of direct experience of that reality to make sure that what argumentatively seems persuasive to us also actually exists as well. So, for example, Kant says somewhere that it is absolutely necessary. It is absolutely necessary that one should convince oneself that God exists. So existence of God needs to be conviction. Conviction. Must be Iman. But, he says, but that his existence should be demonstrated, that it proved through argumentation, is not so necessary. I think this is from one of his earlier writings. But what a mature Kant would say is that actually you can't prove existence through demonstration. That's why he rejects the persuasiveness, at least the decisiveness of all the arguments for the existence of God, although he retained a soft spot for the argument for design, because existence is not something which can be demonstrated. Existence is something which needs to be experienced at some point. But Kant denies that we can have experience of God, because we only have experience of physical reality. Our senses are, and we don't have any sense or intuition, which mystics claim, or which some empirical philosophers even claimed. We don't have any direct experience of God. Even if we have a direct experience of God, it is subjective, and there is no way of proving its objectivity. That's why I can't think that we can't have knowledge of God, and we can't have speculative knowledge of God. In fact, he called this speculative theology, theologians and philosophers dream castle builders. Dream castle builders. They are dream castle builders because their dream castles, we can't be sure whether they correspond to reality or not, because we don't have any means or any senses which can perceive that metaphysical realm. So that's why he does deny the theoretical knowledge of God, and he also denies that we have a speculative knowledge of God. But that doesn't mean that he denies we don't have knowledge of God in any other sense. Because Kant's humanism is based on knowledge of God and a conception of God. And we know God, according to Kant, many ways through our own subjectivity, through our own rational will, which is for Kant absolute will and goodwill. The only good in the universe is our own will, which has these two capacities: freedom and reason. These in combination, and reason is based on freedom, and freedom is then self-limited, self-disciplined by reason, and that is Kant's conception of moral law. So because there's one being which in its capacity as freedom and reason is absolutely good, which is human being, absolutely good but finite and limited, because this body is attached to us. So that's why we are not pure reason and pure freedom. Pure freedom. And here Descartes' influence is very obvious, as I have been alluding to in these sessions. So Kant argues that since we have one being which has freedom and reason, but that freedom and reason is limited by our body, so it's a finite. Freedom and reason themselves are infinite, but they are sort of bounded by finite. So we are sort of caged in this finite body and matter. So we can assume that there's infinite being which is pure freedom and reason, and that being he calls God. In fact, there are other beings, they are all divine beings, among them angels. So in fact, Kant has a conception of knowledge. The only thing is that conception of knowledge is based on his practical reason, which is based on human experience of his or her own freedom and reason. And through this experience of the infinite freedom and reason and the absolute goodness, that we can conceive of a being which is infinite and not bounded. Because unless Kant had some conception of knowledge of this sort, Kant's moral philosophy is not even possible. Kant's moral philosophy assumes some practical knowledge of God in the sense I just described. That's why he, as I said previously, he claims that God and we humans share. What do we share? Membership in a single moral community. And how do we share this? So we are in communion with God, like we and God belong to the same species, so to speak. And that species is the species, and we form a single moral community, and we are member of that. God and angels and humans equally member of that, based on the fact that we have freedom and reason. So from this we can assume that Kant's conception of God is the concept of God as pure freedom and pure reason. And we, through our freedom and reason, partake in this Godhood. That's why Kant says that we can think of ourselves as, and these are Kant's words, analogous to the divinity. Analogous to the divinity. Why? Because God is freedom plus reason, and we are freedom plus reason. So as far as our freedom and reason is concerned, we are God too. The only thing is our God is limited by our bodies, and that actual God, or the supreme God, presumably. So in that sense, Kant's conception of God is very similar to Aristotle in a sense. Here, God is basically pure actuality without any matter. And this conception of God and humans as forming a community with God is the exact opposite of Abrahamic faiths, Islam, the only Abrahamic faith, which is Islam, which is based on the worship of God. And there's no wonder that Kant hated the conception of worship. He hated worshiping God, because he said when we worship God, we respect ourselves. We disrespect ourselves as God ourselves, because we are God. So we should never worship God. In fact, we should always follow our own freedom and reason, because that freedom and reason is divine. And that's why we should never follow God's law or Sharia. So no wonder, when the Western intellectuals and tradition reject Sharia, they reject on the very same basis. Not just, they had the same arguments against Jews before the arguments they propose against or marshal against Muslims today. And that argument is the Kantian argument. That is, to follow the will of God is to demean ourselves. That's why. And that's foundation of modern Christianity as well. That's what Paul said. And that's what Paul's greatest disciple, one of Paul's greatest disciple, at least the second greatest disciple after Augustine, Luther said. And Luther is for very well-deserved reason is the founder of the religion of modernity, which is Protestantism. And Kant was a Protestant, a pietist, coming from a pietist family. So there's no comparison with Ghazali at all. I don't know. Yeah. Why would one think that there's any comparison between Kant and Ghazali? Beats me. So there is, however, one important difference between Ghazali and Kant. Consistently with his principle, could not affirm the possibility of knowledge of God. So this sentence is only partially correct. Kant does deny the theoretical knowledge of God, and he also denies the speculative knowledge of God, but it doesn't deny the practical knowledge of God. And his whole philosophy, or moral philosophy at least, is based on and his humanism is based on a knowledge of God, which is of a being, which is pure freedom and pure reason. And humans are divine to the extent that they partake in that freedom and that rationality. Ghazali didn't have any such conception. Ghazali, finding no hope in analytic thought. I mean, he wasn't looking for any hope in analytic thought or conceptual thought. He just analyzed in his Tahafa and his other works the mandate of reason. He said that if you look at his definition of Ilm al-Kalam, probably we should actually have a glance at it. We had a few videos I made before about Ghazali's conception of Kalam. But anyway, Ghazali says in his definition of Kalam that through reason, through conceptual thought, we can only prove the possibility that God exists and possibility of the prophethood. And after that, reason stops, because reason can't self-sufficiently establish that God exists, and can't give us any knowledge of God. Not because Ghazali had hope that it could, but through his analysis of the scope of reason, he came to the conclusion. The conclusion which was well established before him through, for example, Ash'ari conception of at-tahsin wa taqbih al-aqli. Because if we could have a knowledge of God through reason, there was no need of revelation. We need revelation precisely because reason cannot give us knowledge of God beyond establishing its possibility. So Ghazali, finding no hope in analytic thought, moved to mystic experience. They found an independent content for religion. Probably we should stop here. We already have gone longer than our normal time. So we'll pick up this Ghazali's conception of knowledge of God in the next session, inshallah. Thank you.